You're sitting in front of a wall of switches, 30 of them in a row, each one a little stronger than the last. Somewhere behind a wall, a stranger you just met is strapped to a chair. Your job is simple. Read him a word. If he gets it wrong, flip the next switch. By switch 10, he grunts. By switch 15, he's yelling to be let out. By switch 20, he's pounding on the wall, shouting about his heart. You glance at the man standing beside you. Gray lab coat, clipboard, steady voice. He doesn't tell you to stop. He says 4 words. Please continue the experiment. So here's the real question, not the comfortable one. Would you flip the next switch? This isn't a hypothetical. It happened in a basement lab at Yale to 40 real people who thought they'd signed up for a memory study. Most people say no. Obviously no. But when this actually happened, most people said yes. This is the Milgram obedience experiment, and it produced one of the most unsettling results in the history of psychology. To understand why anyone ran this test, go back to a courtroom, not a lab. In April 1961, a former Nazi officer named Adolf Eichmann stood trial in Jerusalem. He'd helped organize the deportation of millions of people to concentration camps. Reporters expected a monster. Instead, they got a small, forgettable bureaucrat who kept repeating the same defense. He was just following orders. The philosopher Hannah Arendt watched that trial and coined a phrase for what she saw. The banality of evil, not a monster, a man doing his paperwork. Milgram wasn't a neutral observer either. He was Jewish, and he had relatives who'd narrowly gotten out of Europe before the worst of it. The question of how ordinary people become willing participants in mass harm wasn't academic for him. It was personal. A psychologist at Yale, he had a harder question sitting underneath Arendt's phrase. Could it happen here? Not in Germany, not in the 1940s. In America, with ordinary neighbors, 3 months after that trial began, he decided to stop wondering and actually test it. Milgram put an ad in the newspaper offering $4 for an hour of a psychology study. 40 men answered, ages 20 to 50. Teachers, engineers, postal workers. Nobody unusual. At Yale, each man met 2 other people. One was introduced as a fellow volunteer, a mild, likable man named Mr. Wallace. The other wore a gray lab coat and introduced himself as the experimenter. A drawing decided who would teach and who would learn. The drawing was rigged. The real participant always became the teacher. Mr. Wallace was always the learner, and Mr. Wallace worked for Milgram. The learner was led into a separate room and strapped into a chair with an electrode taped to his arm. The teacher sat in front of a machine with 30 switches, labeled from slight shock all the way up to a blunt red XXX at 450 volts. In between sat labels like moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock. And near the top, a blunt 2-word warning, danger, severe shock. Every time the learner missed a word, the teacher was told to shock him. And to move 1 switch higher with each new mistake. The shocks weren't real. Mr. Wallace was an actor, and every grunt and scream came off a tape recorder synced to the switches. But the man holding the switches had no idea. As far as he knew, he was hurting a stranger, a little more, over and over. Around 200 volts, the pounding on the wall started. By 280, it turned into screaming. Then, past 300 volts, the room on the other side went completely silent. Nothing at all, which somehow felt worse than the screaming had. Some participants asked out loud whether the learner was even still alive. The man in the coat told them to treat no response as a wrong answer and keep going. Whenever a teacher hesitated, the man in the gray coat had exactly 4 lines ready, in order. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. 4 sentences. No threats, no raised voice, no consequences spelled out. Just a calm man with a clipboard, repeating himself. Before running a single session, Milgram asked a group of psychiatrists to predict the outcome. Their guess, maybe 1 person in 1,000, would go all the way to 450 volts. You have to be a genuine sadist to do that to a total stranger. Every single participant went to at least 300 volts. 26 out of 40, 65%, went all the way to the end. Full voltage. The switch marked XXX. And it wasn't easy for them. People sweated through their shirts. They laughed, but the wrong kind of laugh. the nervous kind. Some dug their fingernails into their own palms hard enough to leave marks. One man had what looked like a seizure and had to be pulled aside so a doctor could check on him. Milgram later wrote that he hadn't expected this. He'd built the study assuming almost nobody would obey past the first sign of real distress. Almost nobody in that chair felt nothing. Most of them kept flipping switches anyway. When Milgram published the results in 1963, the reaction was immediate and split. Some called it one of the most important studies of the century. A psychologist named Diana Baumrind called it one of the cruelest experiments ever run on human subjects. Full stop. Here's what makes this more than a shocking headline, though. Milgram didn't stop at one version of the room. He ran 19 separate variations over the following year, changing a single detail each time, just to see what actually moved that number. Move the teacher into the same room as the learner, close enough to see his face, and obedience dropped to 40%. Force the teacher to physically press the learner's hand onto the shock plate himself, and it fell again, down to 30. Take the experimenter out of the room entirely and have him give the orders by phone instead, and obedience collapsed to 20%. A few participants even lied to him, saying they were still going while they'd actually stopped. It's one of the clearest signals in the whole study. Once the authority figure wasn't physically present, people were far more willing to quietly disobey. Move the whole study off Yale's campus into a plain, run-down office downtown, stripping away the university's name and prestige, and obedience still held near half. Then the biggest drop of all. Put 2 other teachers in the room, actors who refused partway through and walked out. Obedience fell all the way to 10%. Just watching somebody else say no made it dramatically easier to say no yourself. It turned out to be the single most powerful lever in the entire experiment. More powerful than removing the experimenter, more powerful than changing the location. Distance and prestige pushed the number up. Closeness, and one visible act of defiance, pulled it down further than anything else tested. Now, here's what almost never makes it into the short version of this story. Decades later, a researcher named Gina Perry went back through Milgram's original audio tapes. She found that the experimenter often improvised well past those 4 official lines, pushing harder than the published script admits. She also found that a fair number of participants suspected the whole setup was fake, and that the ones who believed it was real were far more likely to refuse. None of that erases the result. It complicates it. The obedience was real. It just wasn't as clean or as uniform as the popular retelling suggests. In 2009, a psychologist named Jerry Berger ran a version of the study updated to modern ethical standards, capped at a much lower voltage. The obedience rate he found was almost identical to Milgram's original numbers, decades later. There's a second legacy too, and it's the reason this exact study could never be run quite this way again. The distress it caused those 40 men helped trigger a full rewrite of research ethics. Informed consent. The right to walk out at any point. A review board checking a study before it ever touches a real person. No university would approve the original design today, not without radically changing it first. So pull it together. This was never really a study about electricity or even about cruelty. It was a study about distance. Distance from the person you're hurting and closeness to the person giving the order. Move the victim closer, obedience drops. Move the authority farther away, obedience drops. Put one person in the room who says no. Obedience drops hardest of all. It also means the traits that predict who refuses aren't heroism or raw willpower. They're proximity, and whether anyone nearby has already said no. The uncomfortable finding wasn't that some people are secretly monsters. It's that ordinary, decent people, under the right pressure, in small enough steps, will do something they would never choose to do in one single leap. Nobody hands you 450 volts on the first switch. They hand you 15. So, would you have flipped the last switch? Here's the honest answer. Nobody actually knows what they do until they're sitting in that chair. That's not a comforting thought, and it isn't supposed to be one. But there's a use in sitting with it anyway. The participants in Milgram's variations who refused weren't a different species from the ones who obeyed. They just had a little more distance from the order, or one other person nearby who'd already said no first. That's a strange kind of reassurance. Resisting authority isn't a personality trait you either have or don't. It's closer to a skill, and distance and company are most of how you build it. So if you ever feel that quiet pull, the pressure to keep going just because someone with authority told you to, notice it in the moment, not after. Ask where the exit is before you need one. Find the person in the room willing to say no first, or be that person yourself. The point was never to make you feel superior to the people who obeyed. It was to make you a little more alert the next time you're the one being asked to keep going. Because the switch that matters most usually isn't the last one. It's the first one you don't flip.